I want to first outline the main thrust of Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution, which he developed in the late 1920s as a challenge to the prevailing consensus in the socialist movement. And then I want to consider some examples that I think explain the significance of the theory and why it remains important for understanding the character and the potential for revolution in the Global South today. So the theory of permanent revolution addresses three interrelated concerns. First is, what is the role of the working classes in developing countries where they are relatively small, a relatively small section of society? This is not so much the case today, but was certainly the case in Trotsky's time. Second, the theory proposes that there is the potential for an uninterrupted revolution or an uninterrupted transition from the bourgeois democratic revolution to the socialist revolution. And that's the sort of, crux of it. But the third concern is that it also involves a consideration of the international extension of that revolutionary process leading to the construction of socialism on a world scale. So it rests on the idea that the bourgeoisie, or the capitalist class, after the 1848 revolutions, ceased to be a revolutionary class. As a result, the decisive revolutionary role in society falls to the proletariat or the working class. In other words, the working class is the only class that is capable of realizing the goals of the democratic revolution. It can only do this by pushing through the tasks of democracy into socialism. The bourgeoisie, the capitalist class, is no longer capable of doing that. So during the English, American, and the French revolutions, the great bourgeois democratic revolutions of the 17th and 18th centuries, which overthrew aristocratic rule, ushered in capitalism, the capitalist class at that time was a revolutionary class. The working classes at that time were fledgling, they were fragmented, and they hadn't developed, as a result, the capacity to act independently of the bourgeoisie. The significance of the 1848 revolutions, and Marx writes about this in detail, is that for the first time, in some countries, and in particular France, the working class of workers began to raise their own demands and organize independently. And it had become clear to at least the most advanced workers that political freedoms were not enough and that social and economic questions had to be addressed. Of course, to the bourgeoisie, this was an unacceptable situation. An independent and increasingly combative working class had to actually be suppressed, and certainly weren't going to countenance pushing through a sort of real democracy. So once workers started to raise independent demands, the capitalist class became terrified of all revolutionary action. Writing in 1963, Tony Cliff, who was the founder of the International Socialists, he said that a bourgeoisie which arrives late on the capitalist scene is fundamentally different from its ancestors of a century or two earlier. It is incapable of providing a consistent democratic revolutionary solution to the problems posed by feudalism and imperialist oppression. So essentially, the capitalist class can't complete the dismantling of feudalism or achieve real national independence because it is a conservative force. It's become a conservative force, in part because it shares interests with feudal elements in society and becomes very reluctant to have a kind of thoroughgoing democracy that includes democracy in both the political realm and the economic realm, right? We experience that today. You can vote, but you have no say over, how much you're paid or what the Chancellor of the Exchequer does, or any sort of say in the national budget, and so on. The theory of permanent revolution was a kind of major challenge to the socialist orthodoxy of the time, because it offered a real sort of radical alternative to what was known as the stageist conception of history, which dominated the Second International at the turn of the century. So the stageist approach, so if you think permanent revolution argues that there will be a kind of uninterrupted transition from the bourgeois democratic revolution to the socialist revolution, or there, at least it poses the possibility of that. And of course, the working class has a central role, and this can then be extended to the international scale. The stageist approach is effectively the opposite of that, or arguing something very different. The stageist approach is essentially arguing that developments in any given country would move along a succession of historical stages, whereby socialist revolution would be determined mainly by economic potential, by the economic potential of that country. So socialism was only possible as an outcome of a process of industrialization once the productive forces in a country reach a certain level of development. And only then could you have socialism. And here Trotsky is making a fundamental break with that orthodoxy, that every country had to go through a series of stages in order to achieve socialism, and that the class struggle in the developing world would therefore have to focus on developing the productive forces of capitalism before socialism could be realized. So he elaborated this theory of permanent revolution in the course of debates with Stalinism in the late 1920s. As I said, it was also a direct attack on the idea of socialism in one country, which Stalin famously advocated. Trotsky argued that the completion of the revolution cannot be done within the bounds of one country or within national limits. And this was particularly so in the developing world, partly because imperialist powers would isolate and crush the revolution, which is actually what happened in the years after the Russian Revolution in 1917, and partly because no developing country had the resources to produce the kind of plenty on which socialism had to be based. So the socialist revolution, according to Trotsky, is by definition permanent, also in the sense that it has to be global. And of course, if there were revolutions in the developing world, this would undoubtedly influence most industrialized countries. It couldn't sort of, happen in isolation, at least regionally, if not internationally. So then, if the capitalist class then is incapable of leading a revolution for real democracy, then it falls to workers. And if it falls to the workers, there is a tendency to take things further into socialism, because they have those interests in continually deepening that democracy and taking it further, as far as possible, effectively completing a bourgeois revolution. So who leads a revolution in any country is extremely important. It's crucial. If workers are carrying out the tasks of the revolution, and Trotsky had written that in such a scenario, the democratic revolution grows over immediately into the socialist and thereby becomes a permanent revolution. This is where he got this idea. And he, of course, was building on Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto, when they said, rather than two distinct historical stages, the bourgeois and proletarian revolutions might in fact constitute only two moments of the same uninterrupted revolutionary process. So they start to kind of talk about this idea of a kind of uninterrupted revolutionary process back in the 1840s, and Trotsky's building on this, trying to apply it to the case of the case of Russia, in which the working class was very was a small section of society. And again, if the working classes must lead the revolution, what role for the peasantry? The peasantry, a force that used to be the biggest section in society, still is in a number of countries, in the developing world at least, the peasantry must follow the leadership of the working class. So there might be alliances, but those alliances must be led by the working class. And this is because of the nature of the peasantry. The peasantry itself is incapable of independent action, because it's a sort of atomized section of society. It's not socialized together in a collective workforce in the same way as the working classes are. If you think about peasants working on individual plots of land and so on, in any case, if you did have a rebellious peasantry, it wouldn't be enough to break imperialism. So the stageist approach essentially argued that the growth of productive forces was effectively the defining criteria for social and political development. You had to have a certain level of productive forces, and only then could socialism become a possibility, right? It was therefore, criticisms of it have been that it's therefore economistic. It overprivileges the economic structure of society as determining social life in a kind of mechanical way, and underestimating the conscious subjective elements in political struggle. What this means concretely in the developing world is that if the economy, so the level of industrialization, the numerical weight of the working class, its capacity for production and so on, if the economy is the sole factor for determining the potential for socialist revolution, then the next step is necessarily, okay, let's develop productive forces under a capitalist framework. Let's build capitalism, and then we can have socialism. That's the sort of tendency. And that then leads to kind of, in many cases, would lead to a narrow kind of nationalism and the corresponding tendency to underemphasize a kind of internationalist perspective. So, for a stageist approach, the key task becomes the development of a national economic capacity and the privileging of then cooperating with national capitalists between classes within the nation, right? And at best, postponing working class demands. So in many cases, then the national bourgeoisie, might be seen to be somehow more progressive or less exploitative than an international bourgeoisie. And as a consequence, socialist measures, again, are unavoidably held off until some unspecified point in the future. And again, as I say, the priority becomes, okay, let's build capitalism. Let's build those productive forces under a capitalist framework, and then we can move to socialism. So this economism, nationalism, and so on also then would influence the judgment of the balance of class forces in society. So the prevailing argument on the Russian left after the revolution in 1905 was that the objective conditions of Russia's economic development would determine the level of class consciousness amongst the proletariat. So they were effectively saying that the objective would determine the subjective, and the economy would be the condition of consciousness. So if you apply this today, on the one hand, you would be precluding the immediate and complete emancipation of the working classes in many developing countries by assigning a specific weight to each class within the nation in a kind of mechanical way, without reference to the wider economy, the wider global economy. And on the other hand, you could be sort of romanticizing the role of at least sections of the domestic capitalist class. The national bourgeoisie will, somehow help us develop these productive forces, and therefore, we should work with them. However, if we judge economic development in the context of the totality of the capitalist system at an international level, and argue that the development of modes of production on an international level have an impact on every part of the world, then we can understand that, okay, even if you have enclaves of capitalist industry within developing countries, those would have a disproportionate economic importance. And that, we could then begin to understand the direction of travel is towards accelerating integration of the world economy. So an analysis of the totality would allow us to consider, how capitalism would work in developing countries, how they would have a disproportionate role, how the working classes could have a much bigger role in those economies. And it would also allow us to consider the agency of those working classes in intervening in a revolutionary, potential revolutionary process or a political process in general. So rejecting, so if we reject the kind of stageist, this sort of stageist theory, this kind of economistic, nationalistic, etc., sort of denying or underemphasizing the role of agency and so on. If we reject that sort of theory, it's not to deny that the notion of revolution is a process. Of course, it is, with different stages in a sense, but it's really to argue against the stagism as conceived during the Second International. So that type of, that specific kind of conception of stagism. So, I want to argue, and Trotsky argued, that socialist revolutions could occur in societies that had not achieved the advanced capitalism of the West. That was the perspective that the Bolsheviks took during the revolutionary upsurge between 1917 and 1923. And really the unfolding Russian Revolution vindicated Trotsky's theory, because after February 1917, as we know, the weak and vacillating Russian bourgeoisie under Kerensky failed to deliver a stable democracy or any real social progress, or indeed bring an end to the horrors of the First World War. And faced with the growing power and influence of workers through the Soviets, they attempted to, in fact, hold back change. And famously, the provisional government of Kerensky sided with General Kornilov, who tried to organize a military coup weeks before the October Revolution. So this was a weak, liberal provisional government that was afraid of the workers, more afraid of the workers than even the prospect of a military dictatorship and the possible restoration of the Tsar. They would rather have had that than countenance any sort of, moving forward of the Soviets and the Soviets sort of taking power. And by this time, of course, Lenin had come to agree with Trotsky. And when he returned from Finland in April 1917, he argued in his famous April thesis that it was no longer possible really to be on the left wing of the democratic movement. Workers had to lead an alliance with the peasantry and the soldiers to overthrow capitalism, right? So he was really trying to say, we can have this uninterrupted transition from the bourgeois democratic to the to a socialist revolution, and obviously, again, the Bolsheviks did finally adopt this perspective and trying to implement it as far as possible. So that's kind of its time. What about, fast forward a few decades later, what about the anti-colonial movements? In a way, Cliff is writing in 1963 and says, does this pose a challenge to Trotsky's theory, given that some of the anti-colonial movements actually did achieve independence and liberation from colonial rule without achieving socialism? So they didn't have a kind of, uninterrupted transition that Trotsky was talking about. A couple of points I think need to be made here. And really, Cliff says, well, yes and no. This is what he calls deflected permanent revolution. This was permanent revolution, but not quite. So first, I think there's 2 points I want to make. First, the working classes actually did play a much more central role in the anti-colonial revolutions between the late 1940s and the early 1960s than I think is normally accepted. Strikes were central to the Indian independence movement, launched in 1942. There was a militant workers movement that was central to the struggles for full independence in Egypt in 1946. There was a general strike in Tanzania in 1947 that shut down the capital. It inspired, moves towards independence. And in fact, Manning Marable and others have argued that actually a nationalist consciousness throughout much of Africa was prefigured by a trade union consciousness and trade union organization. So they did play a central role, and I think we need to recognize that. On the other hand, and nevertheless, they weren't, the working classes in those contexts weren't as experienced, and so could be subordinated by other forces, including the intelligentsia. And this is certainly what happened in Cuba, where, you know, the middle class intellectuals, it was middle class intellectuals that brought Castro to power, more than any other force. And second, I think we also have to recognize that new forms of imperial relations tended to assert themselves in those situations, because, you know, revolutions in some of those countries were led by these new ruling classes formed out of the intelligentsia and the petty bourgeoisie, and they got integrated into, you know, international relations dominated by the imperial powers, where imperialism could hold back the economic advancement of those countries, as we know, particularly through, you know, even if they did achieve independence, particularly through the international financial institutions and their structural adjustment programs, you know, vis-a-vis the World Bank and the IMF. So again, Cliff's point was that this was described as a permanent revolution, which was deflected. The role of the working classes was subordinated at a political level to these new layers. That doesn't mean it would be impossible in the future for the working classes to play a decisive role, but that in those particular situations, they were sort of they played a subordinate rather than a central role. What about the situation more recently? I just wanted to finish, outline a few different examples in the developing world. Nepal is one instance, and I know this situation quite well, where the stageist conception of history dominated the Communist Party, and the Nepali Maoists exhibited a version of all three problems that I was talking about earlier: economism, nationalism, and a kind of lack of a view of the totality. And they used the question of the level of productive forces to argue that Nepal is neither ready for socialism nor able to carry out a socialist revolution. Instead, the productive forces must be expanded through capitalist development. And this was the Communist Party arguing this. In an interview with the Financial Times shortly before the Constituent Assembly elections in 2008, the chief theoretician of the party, Babram Bhattarai, argued, "Our immediate agenda is not to build socialism, but to build a strong economic foundation which will pave the way towards transition to socialism in the future. Our main intention right now is to abolish all remnants of feudalism and build the way for having a developed, industrial, capitalistic economy in the country. That means there will be full scope for the private sector and nothing will be nationalized or socialized." Pretty incredible. So the ultimate logic of this played itself in the most dramatic way, forcing the Maoists to take positions in complete opposition to their rhetoric. So Bhattarai stressed that the private sector would play a very important role in Nepal's economic development. The Nepali government, the Maoist government, would facilitate that role by creating a conducive environment for investment. All national and international investors who were interested in Nepal's economic development were welcome, you know, and the ultimate consequence was that, you know, the revolutionary potential was reduced to economic potential, and economic development was separated from political demands and indeed social realities, constantly leading away from confrontation and towards accommodation. And also they argued, you know, that we have to work with the national bourgeoisie, you know, that the national bourgeoisie was fighting a progressive battle against the international bourgeoisie. So for national capital to be developed, workers had to work with the national capitalist class in the interest of capitalism. And I just wanted to quote you one more quote from Bhattarai again. He said, both the management and workers have a common interest now for the development of the economy. They both fought against feudalism, autocracy, and monarchy. To create a vibrant industrial economy is now in the interest of both the management and the workers. There were some disputes, especially regarding the minimum wage issue. So what I appeal to management is that they should provide the minimum wage, and what I appeal to workers is that they shouldn't resort to strikes. So you have this incredible situation where, the left, the Communist Party, because of this sort of, we can only have socialism at some unidentified point in the future, we've got to build capitalism in the here and now. So just an example of the consequences. Now, we also saw the return at the same, around the same time of revolutionary movements in the global south, most famously in Egypt and Tunisia and elsewhere in 2011. In both those countries, the working classes, of course, played a key role, massive strikes in the textile industry, but right across the working class. The problem there, I think, was that those struggles were not integrated into a revolutionary process whereby there could develop institutional mechanisms in which the working class could stabilize the situation in its favor, like the Soviets could or started to do in 1917. Obviously, there's much more to say about that, but there's a new cycle, I would say, of revolutionary upsurge that started in 2019 and is continuing, I think, to this day. There's an argument that, somehow neoliberalism has hollowed out the working class in the global south, and I think we should, cut against those sorts of arguments. There was a report in 2019 about the strikes in the newly formed Sudanese Professionals Association, and they were talking about the extent of the strike, the depth of the strike. 95% of high schools were closed, 80 to 90% of public road transport was stopped, 99% of domestic flights were stopped, 100% of railway traffic. So it's possible that the working class can play this huge role in withdrawing their labor, where the middle classes are in fact, being pulled to the left, drawn into action, and so on, where again, the working classes are leading. So this is perfectly possible. And not only that, when this process starts to happen, it gives those working classes enormous confidence in their own power. Of course, we're starting to see this today in this country, whereby strikes that are happening in bigger unions and bigger sectors can start to draw in smaller unions and other sections of the working classes that maybe didn't think about striking. Now, all of a sudden, strikes are on the agenda. So I think if any conclusion can be drawn from all of this, I think that if we really believe that, that the Democrats, the so-called Democrats in the capitalist class, fear the working classes more than than any alternative, I think that should give us some hope for our own power and the kind of solidarity and potential for the kind of action that could lead to revolution in any country.